with Chapter 16, what we're looking at here are the railroads. And it's very easy and it's incredibly tempting to get all, deterministic in thinking that the railroads really did represent the United States becoming that developed country that it did. Remember, if we go all the way back to the very beginning of this course, one of the reasons why we're studying this history of the United States as economic history is to understand how it transitioned from a developing country to a developed country in such a short period of time. And so you look at the railroads, and it's somewhat tempting and perhaps a little bit too easy to say, well, it was the railroads that brought that because of their ability to move quickly, their ability to basically unite the country, and their ability to move massive loads of products. But one thing we're going to see basically in this chapter is that railroads were not the key thing that brought development to the United States. So let's look at what was the problem. Right, is that after the Civil War, the challenge is that a great deal of the wealth existed in the West, but that it was difficult to get it to the East, where the number of consumers were and where it could be transported to the Old World. You basically had water, and to do that you had to go all the way under South America and then back up across South America back up to the East Coast over land, so you could just transport it by horse on trails, or you could transport the products by water to Panama, then put it on a small train across Panama, then reload it onto a boat and bring it up the east to the East Coast. None of those were great options. So in 1853, it was decided to build the railroad to the west. The debate became where to start it. And all the Midwestern states were kind of trying to get it, and ultimately it was placed in North Platte, Nebraska. And it's largely because other means of transportation to the west were already based out there, like the Pony Express. What gets passed is the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. Now remember, this is during the Civil War, where you're starting to get the realization of how important the railroads are to winning the war for the North. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 establishes two railroads: the Union Pacific Railroad, which exists to this day, and the Central Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad was going to build west from North Platte all the way to Nevada. And the Central Pacific Railroad was going to start in California and build east and get to get to Nevada. What the government was going to do is it's going to give the land needed to build this, and it's going to give loans for construction for each mile built. Those loans were originally being sold as first mortgage to the government, meaning that if you borrowed against it multiple times, the government had to get paid back first. But then when not enough people were buying it, the government agreed to be second mortgage. What that meant is that they could then sell those loans to others, to the public, and the government would get paid the second mortgage. The railroad gets completed in 1869, long after the Civil War is dead, go down, Abraham Lincoln, the president who started it, is dead. Here is the somewhat famous picture at Promontory Point, where the two sides, basically, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, where the two sides meet with each other. I have seen the original Golden Spike. It's at Stanford University, actually. Leland Stanford being the person whom Stanford University is named after, but Leland Stanford also being one of the large financiers of this transcontinental railroad. One of those, there were 4 golden spikes, 4 golden railroad spikes, and one of those for the original one, I believe it's the original one, is on the Stanford University campus. I've actually seen 2 of them. The second one is at the Union Pacific Railroad Museum in Nebraska. I'm not a railroad person. It was a stop along the way when I was first moving to. My wife is from Hawaii originally, and when I was moving to Hawaii, I was driving our vehicles to California, obviously to put them on the boat to bring them here, and along the way I stopped in Nebraska to stretch my legs, and I stretched my legs at the Union Pacific Railroad Museum, and I saw the railroad spike, a second of the spikes for Union Pacific, which is a railroad that still exists to this day. So there we go. You've got the meeting of the 2 railroads here. Actually, I've also seen one of the in Wyoming, there's this weird, like, pyramid kind of like structure, which I've also stopped at along the road at one point, and it's called the Ames Monument. It's in the middle of like nowhere, Wyoming. It's actually just outside of Laramie, Wyoming, which is home to University of Wyoming, where I was giving a guest lecture at the time, and I just kind of like traveled around and drove around a little bit, and I saw this Ames monument, and it was built after the person who essentially designed the Transcontinental Railroad. This was one of the stops along the railroad. And the monument, again, just kind of celebrates the fact that this railroad required a lot of money, a lot of design experience, and Oakes Ames and Oliver Ames, the 2 brothers, were the ones that financed the railroad privately as much as they could. And so they got a little pyramid for themselves. So I guess it's the 3 connections I could have to this railroad. And here's our path here. So this is where the one spike is that I've seen, which is the start of the railroad at the Union Pacific in basically present-day Lincoln, Nebraska. And then here's where the Ames Monument is, right about here. Here's where Laramie, Wyoming is. The Stanford University campus is obviously way over here, San Francisco. Oakland, to be exact. And then here's our point where the 2 meet. Now, what was agreed to originally was that Central Pacific was only going to go as far as Nevada, but then they were allowed to go further east And then Union Pacific just worked as hard as they could to go west, and they basically met at Promontory Point. This railroad, again, took a lot of money to build, a lot of time to build, but it then connects everything. Because then what comes from this railroad, this first transcontinental railroad, 1869, that when it's completed, there's a telegraph line as well. And basically, the telegraph, the opening of the line, the railroad line, is delivered by telegraph to the president in Washington, D.C., with the simple line of basically, it's done. It is done. Thus opening it up. I believe the journey took 4 days, I think, 3 or 4 days. You can actually still go on this route. Amtrak still goes on this route somewhat, for at least part of it. It does it in about the same amount, about 2 days. It takes it about 2 days to go from Chicago to California. But from Nebraska, it then connects to the East Coast. Because then it's going to go to St. Louis, it's going to go to Minnesota, Iowa, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Chicago, Illinois, mostly to Chicago, Illinois. And then it's going to go out to New York, out to Pennsylvania, out to Washington, D.C., out to Boston. And thus, we have a country brought together even further. The advantage of bringing things to St. Louis would be that you could take things down the Mississippi River. Once you're getting stuff to Chicago, you've got the New York Central Railroad that in 1877 completes the route from New York to Chicago. If I'm not mistaken, it was about a 1-day trip. And a lot of this rail that's being built is to take, again, the wealth from the West and even the agricultural products in the Midwest and deliver it east. And so while all this investment's being made in the railroads in the West, in the Midwest, and the North, you really don't have a great deal of expansion of the rail in the South. For the most part, what you have is reconstruction of the rail in the South. Now here's the modern railroad network in the United States. This is from the textbook. A few comments about this. The Burlington Northern still exists, but it's actually owned by Warren Buffett now. Southern Pacific Railroad does not exist anymore. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe actually merged with Burlington Northern. Illinois Central Gulf does not exist anymore. Norfolk Southern still exists. CSX still exists. Conrail still exists. Trying to think here if I look at this. Not much more to say about it. This represents, this looks to be a map from probably the 90s, the 1990s, I'm thinking. Most of these railroads, I mean, there's just a lot of consolidation in the railroad in the past 20 years. But what you can see is that it's a network. It's a building of a network, and it's a lot like an airline network that exists today, where you basically have hubs where the traffic is all portioned out to. Now you'll notice here that even in the Burlington Northern here, you've got all these like little side routes here. That's going to become important to our discussion here, because part of that's going to be basically short haul traffic to basically pick up specific commodities. For instance, out here, this little part right here is all to pick up some iron ore. That a pretty big deposit exists in northern Wisconsin there. You're obviously building it out to the west coast of Transcontinental Railroad, and you obviously had gold there in the 1840s, 1850s. And it's not so much for delivering passengers as it is for delivering goods. Unlike Hawaii, railroads are a critical part of the infrastructure, transportation infrastructure on the mainland. It represents the bulk of the delivery of products, of manufactured goods, of commodities between locations. And you see this rapid expansion here in the amount of track that we have. Because we go from 53,000 miles at basically the point where the Transcontinental Railroad was completed to 40 years later having a structure that's over 5 times larger. 266,000 miles of railroad track. Obviously, as we're going over time, we're seeing the percentage growing by a smaller portion, but it's still always an increase. And it's a building of an infrastructure that for the most part exists in some level to this day. Now, one of the things that's highlighted in the book, and which is also true, is that these railroads, they're expanding in size, but they're also more efficient. Because the way that railroads are structured from an accounting perspective is that they have incredibly high fixed costs. You got to build the rail, you got to buy expensive locomotives. And so as they can do things in a larger scale, they get those economies of scale where the average costs are going to fall. And basically the railroads are going to become more efficient. The rails are going to become stronger. The locomotives are going to become stronger. You're going to have safety innovations such as air brakes that are all going to allow more stuff to be transported more quickly. Now, eventually the productivity of railroads does fall, but it doesn't happen for a pretty long time. Not until the eve of World War I. Now, the United States government, for financing these railroads, didn't ask for much. In fact, really the only thing they asked for was some preference in moving their products, their military goods, on those railroads lines, and something about, people on government business being able to ride the rails for free. But most of those things are generally disposed of. The other thing was that the U.S. government reserved the right to take over the railroads in a time of war, but even that wasn't, I don't think that was actually done. Now I quote here the line from page 284 because it is pretty important here. The railroads were not, in themselves, the cause of America's rapid economic progress in the 19th century. But for several generations of Americans, they symbolized the ceaseless wave of entrepreneurial energy and technological advance that was the cause of progress. I absolutely agree with that. Now, you don't need to, but I do. It's kind of like railroads and airplanes. The thing that always makes me concerned about those industries is that people just get so enraptured in like railroads and planes for the wrong reasons. A train is a technology. A rail is a technology. And you're not going to have just a single technology being all the source of rapid economic growth in the latter 1800s and early 1900s. It's going to be a culmination of things inspired by the railroads. Things that we'll actually look at in the next chapter when we look at the impact that railroads had in industrial organizations. One of the arguments made as well by none other than Schumpeter, the famous economic historian, was that the railroads were built ahead of demand to encourage demand for their services, meaning that they were built in basically barren land before anyone was out there growing stuff. And then the people come out there because of the rail and they start growing stuff. But the data seems to suggest that that wasn't true. It's not that the railroads encouraged the construction of the railroads sooner than otherwise would have been. In fact, it seems like the only impact that the government support had was in having the train go over, serve one town rather than another. The states did, and even cities did, heavily subsidize the railroads, just like they had canals and even roads. But it still didn't push the railroads to build faster than what the need required, faster than what people needed. And a total of $175 billion in government bonds were issued to Union Pacific and the Central Pacific for the building of this railroad. So that's the entire amount of the subsidy. But what we see in the next chapter, and even right here, is again, one of the reasons why railroads are so important to the economic story, the economic growth story of the latter 1800s, is that it revolutionized the way that large-scale financing occurs in the United States. The railroads were the first modern corporation in the United States. You've got all these bonds. You even got stocks of Central Pacific and Union Pacific. And essentially the investment banks are just going to go out there, go town to town, and sell these bonds. And even try to sell the stocks. The bonds turned out to be much more important. But that's how you did it. That's how you sold investments back in the day. You went door to door and sold bonds, which people had some basic understanding of because the financial product that was sold before these bonds was life insurance. And sometimes it was the same company offering both, but not all the time. The interesting thing that the railroads did do, and which truly allowed them to serve as an example of the modern corporation, was that they did engage in price discrimination. If you remember from your economics classes, price discrimination means charging different prices for the same good based on a different willingness to pay. And one of the matters is that on a rail, you have both short traffic and long traffic. Short haul traffic is basically transporting it from a farmer's field to the grain house, let's say, or to the basically what's called the co-op, basically, but where you would sell your seed and store it or bring it to market right away. that kind of traffic, short haul traffic, was charged more per mile than the long haul traffic. And then from an economics perspective, from an economist perspective, that's actually a good thing. What makes it price discrimination is that you could say, if you're transporting something, prove to me where you're transporting it to, and then I'm going to come up with a price based on, in part, what are you transporting? What direction are you going? And how many competitors do I face as a railroad? If I don't give you a good deal, where else are you going to go? All of that led to, again, short haul traffic being charged more than long haul traffic. Some of the states like Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota tried to get involved and regulated the railroads. Now these are states that are growing to agricultural products, so they were hurt by the short haul traffic rules. So they're basically going to Congress then to say they probably want to be exempt from the tax, or in this case, that they want to pay the same rates that long haul shippers are using. And while the states do regulate the railroads, the federal government largely stays out of it until the Interstate Commerce Commission is formed in the beginning of the 20th century under Roosevelt. And so you have some traffic then that's being hurt by the state regulation of the railroads. But for the most part, the railroads can't push it too much because, again, on some of those tracks, there is only one railroad. So you can complain about it, but how else are you going to transport the grain? You going to do it yourself? So you can complain about the price, but at the end of the day, you're probably still going to pay it.